Mountains of toxic waste rise above Picher, Oklahoma, once the lifeblood of a mining empire, now branded by the EPA as the most toxic town in America. Sinkholes scar the ground, and chat piles tower over streets. Families were warned the ground beneath them could swallow homes or poison their children. Government buyouts were already in motion. The town was half empty, crumbling, dangerous, and yet a few stubborn residents refused to leave their homes. On May 10th, 2008, it was not the earth that delivered the final blow. It was an EF4 tornado that tore through the southern part of town, churning poisonous dust into the air and wiping the town from the map. The tornado became the final nail in the coffin, turning a dying community into a ghost town overnight. Why did fate target a place already condemned? And how did one storm erase what decades of contamination could not? The answer begins with the poisoned heart of Picher. In the early years of the 20th century, a quiet patch of prairie in northeastern Oklahoma changed overnight. Beneath the grass and shallow creeks, prospectors struck a motherlode of lead and zinc. By 1917, Picher became the beating heart of the Tri-State Mining District, a network of tunnels and mills stretching across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. The earth here supplied more than half of the lead that filled American bullets in World War I. Ore trains rattled through town day and night, and the population exploded to over 14,000. Miners poured in from across the Midwest, chasing steady pay and the dream of prosperity. But every ton of valuable ore came with a hidden cost. For every rail car of lead, mountains of crushed rock called chat were dumped in sprawling piles. These gray-white mounds, some taller than a 15-story building, grew around the edges of town, swallowing fields and roads. The chat was laced with lead, cadmium, and zinc, metals that would leach into the soil, the water, and the lungs of anyone unlucky enough to live nearby. By the end of World War II, Picher mines had produced more than $20 billion in ore, but also more than 70 million tons of toxic waste. Miners worked by the light of carbide lamps, drilling and blasting through limestone, sometimes 100 feet below the surface. Pumps kept the tunnels dry, but as the veins gave out and profits shrank, the mines were abandoned. The pumps shut off in 1967, and water filled the empty shafts. Groundwater turned sour, picking up heavy metals and seeping into Tar Creek. The once clear stream began to run orange, stained by acid and rust. Above ground, the chat piles became part of daily life. Children played on the slopes, their hands and faces dusted with fine, silvery powder. Some families used chat as gravel for driveways or sand for sandboxes, not knowing the danger. Every gust of wind carried invisible particles through open windows and schoolyards. By the 1970s, the health toll was becoming impossible to ignore. Children with unexplained illnesses, behavioral problems, and blood tests showing lead levels among the highest in the nation. The wealth that built Picher left behind a poisoned landscape. The same mountains of waste that once signaled prosperity now loomed as silent threats, shaping the town's fate long after the last ore car rolled away. The ground itself had become a hazard, and the legacy of mining would haunt every breath, every drop of water, and every childhood spent in its shadow. By the early years of the 2000s, government officials arrived in Picher with a stark message. The town was no longer safe for human life. The Environmental Protection Agency, armed with risk maps and blood test results, began offering buyouts to families living in the shadow of the chat piles. Letters arrived in battered mailboxes stamped with federal seals, promising compensation for homes that could never be made clean. Some residents packed up quietly, their moving trucks trailing dust down roads already buckled by hidden tunnels. Others met in the old city hall, voices rising over folding tables and stacks of paperwork, arguing over property values and the meaning of home. The buyout program, launched after a 2006 Army Corps of Engineers study, offered checks to nearly every remaining household. Officials cited the risk of sinkholes, the poisoned soil, and the invisible metals drifting through the air. But for many, the numbers never added up. Decades-old houses were appraised at a fraction of their worth, and memories could not be measured in dollars. Some accused the EPA of lowballing offers or moving too quickly, while others believed the government had waited too long, leaving them to suffer in a place already written off by outsiders. On some blocks, paint peeled from boarded windows and weeds burst through crumbling sidewalks. Mailboxes bore the names of families long gone. Yet in the midst of this slow unraveling, a few holdouts refused to leave. Elderly couples, their children grown and scattered, kept up their routines, mowing lawns, tending gardens, watching the seasons change. The school remained open, though each year the classrooms grew emptier. At the center of this fractured community stood the school principal, a fixture at every meeting and a constant in the halls. She handed out diplomas under flickering fluorescent lights, organizing graduation ceremonies even as entire grades disappeared. The playground echoed with fewer voices, but the bell still rang each morning. For her and the last teachers, staying was both an act of defiance and a promise to the children who remained. "We are not just a statistic," she told a reporter. "We are a town." Arguments flared at town hall meetings where some residents clung to hope for a cleanup that would never come, while others pleaded for a way out. The EPA risk studies were met with suspicion, and property disputes dragged on for months. By 2008, Picher was a patchwork, half-empty, scarred by loss, but stubbornly alive. Those who remained did so out of loyalty, fear, or simple inertia. They kept the lights on, even as the world insisted it was time to let go. At 5:38 p.m. on May 10, 2008, the sky over Picher, Oklahoma turned black. Sirens wailed as a supercell thunderstorm spun out an EF4 tornado, its winds screaming between 165 and 175 miles per hour. The tornado dropped down just west of town and began its assault, carving a path nearly a mile wide. Its first targets were the chat piles, those gray-white mountains of mining waste that had haunted Picher for generations. The funnel tore into the tailings, shredding their surface and hurling clouds of fine, toxic dust into the air. Witnesses later described the sky turning a strange, dirty gray as the tornado churned through the piles, scooping up debris and blasting it across the fields and streets. The storm moved with terrifying speed, crossing the southern half of Picher in minutes. Houses that had stood for decades collapsed in seconds. Roofs vanished, walls exploded, and entire blocks were reduced to splinters. The tornado's core sliced through neighborhoods already half abandoned, flattening homes that had survived a century of mining but could not withstand the fury of the wind. Trees snapped and vehicles tumbled, tossed like toys in the swirling chaos. Those who remained in Picher had only moments to react. Some huddled in basements, clutching radios and waiting for the roar to pass. Others ran for cover beneath doorways or crouched in bathtubs, praying the ground would hold. The tornado did not discriminate. Condemned houses, family homes, empty lots, and playgrounds were all swept into its path. The school, once the heart of the community, stood just north of the worst destruction, spared by luck and a few hundred yards. The scene was a portrait of stubborn, vulnerable lives caught between a slow poison and sudden violence. As the tornado crossed the town, it left behind a wasteland. Streets disappeared under heaps of debris. Telephone poles and water towers twisted into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with dust, some of it ordinary dirt, but much of it laced with lead and zinc, torn from the very chat piles that had poisoned Picher for generations. The funnel had churned up the tailings, potentially turning the air itself into a poisonous cloud. Emergency responders moved through a landscape that was both a natural disaster and a hazardous waste site, searching for survivors amid contamination and wreckage. The human toll was stark: 6 dead and 150 injured among those who stayed. Survivors crawled from the wreckage into a world that felt unrecognizable. The line between natural disaster and man, made catastrophe, had vanished. In less than 10 minutes, the storm had finished what decades of neglect and contamination had begun. The ground had always been dangerous here. Now the sky had joined in, and nothing in Picher would ever be the same. The tornado's passage left more than shattered homes and splintered trees. In its wake, a strange silence settled over Picher, broken only by the crackle of radios and distant sirens. The air hung heavy with a chalky haze. This was not just storm debris. It was the dust of the chat piles, ground finer by the tornado's violence, now swirling in every breath and coating every wound. Survivors staggered through the wreckage, their faces streaked with mud and powder, eyes burning, throats raw. Some described the taste of metal on their tongues, a bitter reminder of what lay hidden in the dust. 6 people died that evening, their lives claimed by collapsing roofs, flying lumber, or the simple, cruel lottery of where the wind chose to strike. About 150 more were injured, many with deep cuts and broken bones. For the responders who rushed in from neighboring towns, the devastation was familiar. flattened houses and families searching for loved ones. But the danger was different. Every pile of rubble was laced with invisible poison. The EPA had warned for years about the risks of lead and cadmium, but now those metals hung in the open air, stirred up by winds no mask could keep out. First responders worked with what they had: borrowed gloves, bandanas tied over mouths, eyes squinting against the stinging gray. Hazmat gear was scarce, and few had time to think about contamination as they dug through the ruins, searching for survivors. Medical triage became a desperate improvisation. Paramedics carried the wounded to makeshift stations on the edge of town, careful not to track dust into ambulances. Cuts and scrapes, so common after a tornado, took on new danger here. Any open wound risked infection, not just from dirt, but from the heavy metals ground into the debris. Some victims coughed up blood or complained of burning skin. One anonymous survivor later told a reporter that the air turned gray and the wounds burned worse than they should have. As night fell, the scale of the disaster became clear. The National Guard cordoned off entire blocks, warning that some areas were too dangerous to enter, not just because of unstable buildings, but because of the toxic dust still drifting through the air. Rescue crews rotated in and out, washing down with bottled water, their boots and hands stained by a substance no soap could remove. Officials from the EPA and state health agencies arrived with clipboards and masks, but no one could say for sure how much lead was now loose in the streets, or how far the poison would travel. What set Picher apart from every other tornado zone was this: the storm had weaponized the earth itself. The very ground that had driven people away now threatened those who stayed behind. In the hours after the tornado, the town's last defenders realized the truth. This was not just a place destroyed by wind. It was a place that could not and would not be rebuilt. Within weeks of the tornado, federal and state officials swept through Picher with a new sense of urgency. The EPA and FEMA coordinated emergency funds and legal orders, declaring that what remained of the town was no longer habitable, not just because of the poison in the ground, but because the storm had erased any illusion of safety. Buyout checks arrived faster than ever before. Appraisers worked door to door, tallying losses and assigning values to shattered homes and ruined lots. The numbers rarely matched what residents believed their lives were worth. Most residents received between $30,000 and $60,000, sometimes less if the property had already been condemned or damaged beyond repair. Arguments flared over the fairness of these offers, with some accusing the agencies of using the tornado as a convenient excuse to clear the last holdouts with minimal compensation. As the months passed, moving trucks lined the streets. The last families packed up what they could, leaving behind gardens, pets, and sometimes even gravestones. By June 2009, nearly 900 properties had been acquired, and the city's population had dwindled to almost nothing. The school, once the heart of the community, closed its doors for good. Teachers and students scattered to neighboring districts, the final bell ringing in empty halls. On September 1st, 2009, the state dissolved Picher's municipal charter. The town ceased to exist on paper as well as in fact, By early 2011, even the zip code was retired, mail undeliverable, addresses erased from the map. For some, the closure brought relief, an end to years of anxiety and waiting. For others, it was a forced exile, a bureaucratic erasure of history and home. Voices from the Quapaw Nation, long critical of government neglect, called the process both too late and too rushed, a final insult added to decades of exploitation. In the end, Picher was not rebuilt. It was memorialized only by empty lots, fenced-off chat piles, and the bitter memory of a town undone by both earth and sky. Where Picher once stood, only fragments remain. The streets have no names, and the houses have no numbers. Grass creeps through broken pavement, swallowing what is left of driveways and curbs. Rusted playground swings hang motionless beside toppled goalposts. Here and there, a piece of mining equipment slumps in the weeds, its purpose forgotten. The chat piles still loom over the ruins, pale and silent, their toxic dust drifting with every breeze. Fences and warning signs do little to keep out the wind or the rain, and the poison seeps deeper each year. No one is coming back. There are no plans for new homes, and no petitions for restoration. The federal government closed the book on Picher, and the post office erased its zip code. What is left is a ghost landscape, a modern ruin shaped by greed and abandonment. The only ongoing activity is the slow, careful work of environmental remediation, led now by the Quapaw Nation, whose ancestors watched the land change hands and fortunes long before the first mine opened. Their crews sift through contaminated earth, planting grasses to hold the soil, fencing off danger zones, and monitoring the water that still runs orange through Tar Creek. Picher's story endures as a warning. The town vanished not in a single night, but through decades of choices that valued profit over safety and speed over caution. Its memory lingers in empty fields and poisoned streams, a lesson about what happens when the cost of extraction is measured only after everything else is gone. Picher, Oklahoma, lay under mountains of crushed rock, called chat piles, pocked with sinkholes, and poisoned by decades of mining. The Environmental Protection Agency had labeled it the most toxic town in America. Residents were being told to leave because the ground was killing them. Then on May 10th, 2008, the sky decided to finish the job. An EF4 tornado arrived as the final nail in the coffin, turning a dying town into a ghost town overnight. Once a booming mining hub, Picher became a wasteland of lead and zinc contamination. Government buyouts were already underway. Houses stood half empty, streets cracked, and entire blocks fell into sinkholes. A few stubborn residents refused to leave their homes, choosing memory over safety. They lived vulnerable lives on poisoned ground. On the afternoon of May 10th, 2008, a violent storm carved a path through the southern part of town. The tornado was an EF4, with winds strong enough to rip roofs from homes and throw cars like toys. It tore through neighborhoods that were already condemned. This was not only wind and flying debris. The tornado churned the chat piles into the air. Lead dust and crushed tailings mixed with the wind, and the air itself became toxic. People who had remained behind suddenly breathed a new danger. In the chaos, 6 people died and 150 were injured. Emergency responders arrived to a scene that smelled of dust and chemicals, pulling survivors from wreckage in a place already designated a Superfund site. Rescue teams had to contend with contamination as well as collapse. Instead of rebuilding, the storm forced a final evacuation. The federal government accelerated buyouts, the school closed, and the city was officially dissolved. Where other towns rebuild, Picher was erased. Today, Picher exists only as a warning. It is a modern ghost town with no zip code, reclaimed by weeds, water, and poison. In a country with over 1,300 active Superfund sites, the line between natural catastrophe and man, made risk, grows thinner each year. The ghosts of Picher remind us that what we bury in our land, we inherit in our future. What would you do if the ground beneath you turned deadly?